Es una alegría y un honor para mí estar acá. Estamos celebrando el 10º aniversario del Foro de la Crítica. Es algo a celebrar, también porque hemos articulado este 10º aniversario con un estado se va a decir, que es el cine experimental, es el cine de vanguardias, que este año tiene su casa propia, digamos, en la programación del festival, de la mano de la nueva sección o muestra, en realidad, titulada Umbrales. Esta sesión del Foro de la Crítica, al igual que la mesa que ya pudieron atestiguar hace unas horas, esta clase magistral también tiene un sesgo, digamos, que tiene que ver con el cine experimental. Es algo que se había tratado anteriormente de manera tangencial, digamos, en anteriores sesiones del Foro de la Crítica, pero que esta vez queremos tratar de manera ya frontal. Para ello, pues tengo el gusto de presentar a Genevieve Yue, que esta sesión estará a cargo de esta clase magistral. Para mí es un gran gusto y voy a leer pues básicamente la semblanza de Genevieve, para no errar también, y para ya finalmente poder pasarle la palabra. Genevieve Yue es crítica y programadora de cine, es profesora adjunta de Cultura y Medios de Comunicación y directora de estudios de pantalla en la Eugene Land College de New School. Su investigación se centra en la organización formal y material de los medios audiovisuales, con énfasis en la historia y la teoría del cine. Los ensayos y críticas de Genevieve han aparecido en publicaciones como October, Grey Room, Art Agenda, Film Comment, Film Quarterly, Reverse Shot y The Times Literary Supplement. Ha organizado proyecciones de películas en Mass Art, Anthology Film Archives, Light Industry, el Wexner Center, Los Ángeles Film Forum y el Milwaukee Underground Film Festival. Actualmente forma parte del Consejo de Administración del Flaherty Seminar, donde también preside el Comité de Programación. Es doctora en Estudios Críticos por la School of Cinematic Arts de la Universidad del Sur de California. En noviembre del 2020 publicó Girl Head, Feminism and Film Materiality, por la editorial Fordham University Press, trabajo que con un rico detalle técnico y de archivo examina 3 lugares de la producción técnica cinematográfica: el laboratorio, las prácticas de montaje y el archivo cinematográfico. Dentro de cada lugar localiza un motivo común: el cuerpo femenino que desaparece, que se transforma en material para ser utilizado en la realización de una película. El libro desarrolla una teoría del género y la materialidad cinematográfica a través de lecturas del cine narrativo, el cine antiguo, el cine experimental y el arte de la imagen en movimiento. Genevieve, muchas gracias por venir acá, por tu palabra y tu generosidad también. Y a ustedes les pido por favor un fuerte aplauso para Genevieve Yue.
Thank you, Max, for that introduction. And I'm going to speak with you today about the practice of writing criticism about experimental film. I'm going to address some of its histories, because I think we should always understand where we're coming from in order to explore what the possibilities are for the present. And I'll talk a little bit about my own formation, my own biography in this field, because it's certainly not something that I studied or was told how to do. But I also hope that together we can think expansively about what the contours of experimental film criticism look like today, and really what the relationship between writing and filmmaking could be. So not just criticism as a received form of journalistic publication, but perhaps a more engaged sense of what writing and filmmaking could, what kind of dialogue they could enter into with each other. So I hope that, I'll keep my remarks fairly brief, and I hope that we can, I can't really see anyone, but I hope that we can have something like a dialogue, and I would be very interested in hearing of, everyone's experiences and interests and why you're even here this evening to talk about this topic. A bit of a disclaimer, my formation is very North American, and that's only been compounded since I moved to New York City and have a closer relationship with institutions like Anthology Film Archives and Filmmakers Cooperative. So my bias leans very heavily in the kind of traditional American avant-garde film, and I'm very eager to maybe undo or expand some of those assumptions. So I'll say a bit first about my own background, that I came to criticism at the same time that I became interested in programming and doing scholarly work. So my own formation as, for me, it's just kind of inseparable to think about these three different areas of practice, and they really do feed into each other. So when I'm attending a film festival such as this one, or places like Rotterdam or New York Film Festival or Oberhausen, I'm thinking about works, I'm excited about work that maybe I want to write about in a critical mode or in a more sustained scholarly one. I may want to bring these filmmakers into my classroom as an instructor. And I'm also thinking about the kind of dialogues among films that I might put together in a program at some point or another. So there's a kind of abiding curiosity and again an interest in how these conversations among works take shape that precedes any kind of disciplinary box that I'm putting them in. But generally speaking, I would say that I'm always searching for a form that suits, that feels satisfying to the kinds of questions I wish to ask about works. And when I encounter a film or an art object, I'm often doing so from the perspective of, I try to do it from a very fresh, or what Francis Flaherty called non-preconception. I try to encounter it spontaneously as much as possible, and to imagine the artwork or the film as itself a proposition or a theorization of what the world is or what the world could be, what the limits and possibilities of that might be. So I really like to think of films as generative interlocutors for me. And I can say more about the kinds of forms of writing that I'm trying to develop for myself. There's a book series that I'm working on that maybe I can say a bit more about. But I think when you're in the field of thinking about experimental film, which itself is already so concerned with questions of form, I think it's kind of natural to start questioning the kind of, the formal practice of writing itself as a response to that cinematic experimentation. So I'm going to move, if you could get to the next slide, or maybe not this one, but the one after this. One more, please. Perfect, thank you. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the history of experimental film writing. And I think we can probably pinpoint this to the immediate post-war period, which saw, so in the late 40s, definitely by the 50s, the founding of many influential film journals, many of them started out quite scrappy and small. So this is, the first issues of, these are the first issues of what would later become Film Comment magazine. So we have that in 1962. Next slide, please. We have Cahiers du Cinéma, of course, kind of legendary among film spaces for serious film writing, and populated by young cineasts that would later go on to become filmmakers themselves, notably François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. Next slide, please. And the journal I'd like to talk a bit more about today, and the practice, is that of Jonas Mekas and film culture. So in this kind of post-war boom of film periodicals, it establishes a space for the kind of serious consideration of film, and also a reconsideration of film history through a particular lens. And I think this is important to think about in contrast to the contemporary landscape, where that kind of investigation into film history is largely happening in the university, in the academy, right? So scholarly inquiry into film history, aesthetics, politics, etc. Today we expect to find in a university setting, but in the 1950s and 60s, that hasn't really yet happened, that the academicization, the disciplinary formation of something like film studies doesn't really exist, doesn't come into being until around the 1960s. So truly, in the, thinking about back to this post-war moment, these periodicals are the spaces in which serious and rigorous film study is happening. So this is an important place where writing is happening as well. So film culture was started in 1955 and lasted until 1996. It was started by Jonas Mekas and Adolphus Mekas, and was an enormously, it had a very small kind of niche readership, but its legacy, I think, looms quite large, not least because Jonas Mekas himself was so important for the development and really flowering of new American cinema, avant-garde film in the United States. Film culture was a place where Andrew Sarris, P. Adam Sitney first got their start writing. They were the kind of early, this is where they were publishing early in their careers. And the kind of editorial intention of Film Comment was to combine analysis and consideration of avant-garde film, like Maya Deren's work or Kenneth Anger, alongside classical Hollywood cinema. So the very first issue has an image of Orson Welles, right? So thinking about the kind of mainstream or narrative cinema in relationship, in dialogue with avant-garde film. And Hayden Guest described this form as a kind of montage technique, right? Already in the editorial intention of Film Comment, there is a kind of montage perspective, an Eisensteinian one, if you want, where these different modes of analysis and different types of films are being brought, they're sitting right beside each other, page by page. And Guest describes this as, actually effectuating a reinterpretation of film history from the point of view of the avant-garde. So his argument, in short, is that with this emphasis on the avant-garde, that becomes the means through which the rest of film history opens up. It centers the avant-garde in relationship and branches out into other areas of film history. One of the guiding missions of film culture, I must say comment, film culture, was to really educate its readership, if not to expand the audience. And that's the expanding the audience piece happens more with Mekas's other endeavor, literary endeavor in The Village Voice, which I'll get to in a moment. But here the idea of film culture really, again, along the lines of filling a sort of, hadn't yet been established a kind of serious space for intellectual inquiry into film. So there's very much a kind of serious engagement with a educating, mission. Okay, so in addition, and I'll say of Jonas Mekas, if you don't know who he is or was an enormously important figure for American avant-garde film, as one of the founders of Anthology Film Archives, a prolific writer, and also a true, one of the great 20th century filmmakers as well. So had his, and also a founding member of the Filmmakers Cooperative. So was very much involved in these different institutions, filmmaking, publishing, and exhibition, in the, through the 50s, 60s, and onward. And in fact, 2022, where we are now, would have been his 100th birthday. So an immensely important figure in many ways, and his legacy is felt in different fields of practice. And today I want to talk specifically about his practice as it reflects his writing. Okay, so let's get to the next slide, please. Great. So The Village Voice is where Jonas Mekas published a weekly column called Movie Journal. And you can get, I think it was recently reissued, you can get an edited volume of Movie Journal, which is really excellent. And I'll show some clips from those pages in just a moment. But when Mekas approached The Village Voice in 1958, and the publication was then only 3 years old, so it was a completely new publication. It was meant to be a kind of downtown, arts and culture rag, a kind of alternative to, the kind of more serious New York Times periodicals that you would have, publications. And really inserted himself early in that process and said, you need someone to write about film. So they gave him the job. And for, about 20 years, a little less than 20 years, continued to write, had total free reign. He was, actually, when he left in 1974, when he stopped writing Movie Journal, it's because it was the first time an editor dared to correct what he had written. So he had previously enjoyed completely unfiltered space in which to express his ideas in writing. Movie Journal is a really fascinating kind of space. Even reading it today, and if you read film reviews regularly like I do, you'll notice that there's a kind of generic form of it. Movie Journal still feels very radical. It's very different. It's very much off the cuff. And I want to give you a sense of what distinguishes Mekas's writing style and his approach, and how we might learn from that in this moment. But let's go to the next slide. So Amy Taubin, who was friends with Mekas and is still writing quite prolifically, I'm just going to read this quote that I have because I think she describes it really well about the impact Movie Journal had, at least on her. And she says, "One has the sense that Mekas is secure in the place from which he speaks, and that he says plainly what's on his mind without fussing about the niceties of prose, dampening down hyperbole, or tailoring his style to the standards of art criticism or journalism. He wrote about the liberation of movies in a voice that inspired liberation." So I like this last line, liberation of movies in a voice that inspired liberation. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so Mekas himself, you see in the pages of Movie Journal, was very much experimenting with form. And I'm breaking this down in 4 categories because I'm a professor and I like to make bullet points, but one way of schematizing what I think he's doing. So in terms of style, right, that the articles in Movie Journal are responsive, like kind of immediately responsive to the works that he's writing about. They're kind of informal, there's a kind of spontaneity to the way that he's writing that doesn't feel burdened, let's say, by providing, a kind of exhaustive, encyclopedic rundown of a director's previous works or what the case might be, right? It's like a conversation, just having a kind of direct response to a film, kind of a breezy openness. You can see, and here's the second point, there's a kind of reflexivity at work too, that Mekas in the pages of Movie Journal was actually very frequently commenting on the practice of criticism itself and thinking about, what is the function of criticism? What can a critic do? What should a critic do? What is that relationship, right? And not necessarily settling on one function or another, but keeping that in play. And I think it's interesting to think about how different films, for example, might inspire one to think differently about the function of criticism. I think that's actually kind of exciting to imagine that. Some film could be so powerful to make the critic, rethink the kind of basic premise of what the job is, so to speak. In terms of practice or expression, I think it's interesting for Mekas, especially given that he was also a filmmaker, did not, again, keep these necessarily in separate boxes, but that criticism for him was coextensive with his filmmaking and artistic practice. And again, itself an expression of experimental form. And if you're familiar with his films, like Walden, for example, there's just the feeling of film culture is not an accidental title, I think, for his journal. There's a feeling of a culture, a living culture, living and breathing in his films. You see all different people of that time and place, and you also re-encounter them again in the pages of Movie Journal. So there's that kind of inclusivity that that suggests the kind of, even though these are, let's say, distinct practices or distinct modalities, they're obviously coming from the same person, the same perspective. And I think that's really exciting to have a critic that is also a filmmaker and has a meaningful relationship between those practices. And then finally, the last area here is what I would call sharing or dissemination, which is that Mekas was very much thinking about sharing work and making it available to a broader audience, right? It's not the burden of the critic, as he saw it, was not the burden of the critic to make the work available. And in many cases, especially with experimental work, right, we're talking about works that don't screen very often, at least in a theatrical setting. In many places, it's hard to find. But that his goal was to get an audience, get a readership interested in something, to want to find out more, and to, make the demand for having access to those works. And I think he really saw himself as, proselytizing a kind of filmmaking that was so much more expansive than the really quite narrow set of films that typically travel to, that one encounters no matter where you live in the world, right? That narrative fiction filmmaking really only accounts for the small, a very, again, very narrow segment of what the form could be, and that his job as a critic was to keep open, right? To keep reminding us that there's so much more to what this practice is and could be, and what it means aesthetically and politically in all these ways. So keeping that door open, if you will. Okay, I think I have another slide here. Can we advance, please? Okay, actually, instead of this, I want to maybe just play the video file, which is just Jonas himself explaining his time at the Village Voice. Show, please. Yes. Here we go. So just to give you a flavor here of Mekas's writing style. Especially the last couple of sentences here. It is my duty to bring this cinema to your attention. I will bark about it until our theaters start showing this cinema. So it's kind of emphatic call to, to bring awareness and hopefully drive interest to this type of filmmaking. Okay. So I think we'll go to the next slide, which is a blank slide, because I'm going to talk just a little bit. Thanks. So to move into the present moment and, serving this, what are the spaces in which experimental film criticism exists? And it's kind of few and far between. And, many of these journals that I mentioned that were founded in the post-war period either ended, like Film Culture, or kind of transformed pretty dramatically. There are other journals that sprang up, like Millennium Film Journal, for example, which was established in 1978 and became very much more a kind of academic, scholarly place of publications, peer-reviewed, et cetera. So I think, as far as there are, basically no, I think, publications solely dedicated to experimental film writing. So what we have are things like academic journals, like Millennium, like Mirage, Moving Image Art and Review Journal. There are plenty of art journals and art adjacent spaces. So as you saw, Art Forum sponsored that video. October is another scholarly place, but has maintained an interest in avant-garde film. And as well as newer places like Four Columns or Art Agenda, where I write sometimes. You have festivals and exhibition platforms like Movies, one of the sponsors of this festival, and many festivals commission writing beyond just their catalogs, right, but just to expand what they're exhibiting. And then here and there are journals that will maintain something of an experimental focus, like, among other things. So I'm thinking of CinemaScope as one place, Reverse Shot. But the fact of the matter is that there are not very many spaces, right? These are not especially popular kinds of films, so it makes sense that there's not especially a kind of a durable publishing platform. But that may, beyond being a hindrance, may also be a freedom for the kind of experiments and form that I'm interested in. But I do want to take a moment to consider the pressures and conditions of writing contemporary experimental criticism, and really look at the spheres of production in which it happens and how it's possible, right? Who is writing and how that writing occurs and what is assumed of the genre. And at least in the United States, which is the context I'm working in, there are no mainstream, full-time film critics employed to solely write about experimental film. Most film critics, period, in the United States are freelance at this point, and certainly those that are employed at a major journal or a newspaper have a responsibility to far more than just experimental work, even if there are people like Amy Taubin, for example, that continue to write about experimental film on occasion. So it's exceedingly rare to have critics even take up the experimental beat. And the fact of the matter is that most critics have to be self-funded to be freelance. right? They usually have to have another source of income in order to make ends meet. And in my own past, I would scrape together what I could to get myself to a film festival so I could watch things and then write about it, usually for a very small fee, and sometimes for no fee at all. So, that's a kind of economic reality of writing, is that there is a kind of, I think, assumed privilege in being able to travel, to watch, and to have the time and space to write in that way. And for me, graduate school was a way of giving myself a kind of buffer in order to think seriously about film work and be able to, find, some funding to make this writing possible. And certainly I couldn't do the activities I do today without my full-time tenure track professor position. So I just want to be very transparent about that that's a kind of economic reality that we're dealing with. Which is not to say that it's a requirement, but that, it is a major factor. But one thing I think is interesting is that, if no one is really assigned to write about experimental film, there's no expectation that there's really any publication about it, we find ourselves in a situation kind of similar to where Jonas Mekas was in 1958 when he approached the Village Voice, right? That there's no one writing about this. Can I have a space? Can you elbow your way into a space or create your own space? So I think that's kind of an interesting proposition that I'd like to follow. Because while, again, mainstream established publications are, let's say, very limited, the ability for people to just write and publish on blogs or on social media or their own websites is very different than of course, where we were at the mid-century. Among critics, now speak just generally about film critics, and not even those who write about experimental work, we can say that there's a kind of pervasive conservatism to that form. And by that I don't mean conservative politics, but I mean conservative in the sense that there's a tendency to reproduce the norms of a form in order to, for it to be perpetuated, so that it can reproduce itself, essentially. So it's conservative in style, right? That criticism tends to be more academic. It follows a certain kind of a set of norms that are established by mainstream film critics that you might read in a place like the New York Times or Art Forum, that is erudite and thoughtful and maybe borderline academic. And here I'm going through the kind of criteria set out by Mekas. So in terms of style, we have that kind of consistency. In terms of reflexivity, there is little to no meditation on what the function of criticism is, right? It's I can't think of a single mainstream critic that takes a moment in the pages of writing to consider what it is they're doing, to use that space to talk about that. So it's not especially interested in itself as a form. As practice, it's in fact, criticism tends to be highly professionalized, right? This is an end in itself. It's not, if Mekas's mode was, criticism and filmmaking are branches off the same limb of a tree, a professional critic is just that, right? That's the kind of career path and destination. In terms of sharing and dissemination, the audience is kind of assumed and built in. There's no, special interest in expanding or reaching new audiences. There's a kind of preaching to the choir often, again, in this kind of conservative vein. And I will say for function, and this is based on my own experience, but I have felt as a critic very acutely aware that my writing, let's say about an experimental film, is often going to be the only writing that particular film might receive in the press. And that is a commodity that is extremely valuable, especially if the filmmaker is, let's say, employed in a university system where that review might be added to, would be part of a review or tenure file for promotion, or used in a grant application to secure funding for a next project. So I'm very I've felt sensitive to that, and perhaps in my own writing have let that kind of awareness of function overshadow what I was doing as a critic, and made me really reluctant to say anything very negative about films because I didn't want to hurt someone's job prospects, essentially. But just kind of the reality that in the kind of scarcity of writing about experimental film, the little writing that does exist assumes this other kind of important function as authenticating a work and shoring up a filmmaker's reputation. But there's more to, obviously, criticism than this kind of conservative set of norms that I've just laid out. Can we have the next slide, please? Next slide, yes. And I wanted just to flag that, one of the dangers of this kind of inherent conservatism of film criticism, in reproducing its assumptions and norms, is that it does tend to leave out a considerable range of filmmakers and filmmaking practices. So Girish Shambhu in Film Quarterly wrote this, I think, wonderful kind of, certainly self-reflexive critique of film criticism, in which he talks about the influence, what are the downsides to reproducing this emphasis on auteurism, right? And what it ends up doing is that it relies on, white, cis, hetero, male auteur filmmakers with established reputations, and tends to exclude, right, to leave on the margins people of color and women filmmakers and the work that they produce, right, and other models for production. And I think to think beyond even what Girish is sketching out in his polemic here is that that kind of auteurist model, again, also privileges narrative filmmaking and leaves and excludes and makes smaller these less easily categorizable forms of filmmaking practice. So really, I'm inspired by this piece as a call for rethinking, again, the practice of film criticism, of film evaluation, to be more inclusive, to be more experimental and a bit wilder in who gets talked about, who's brought into the conversation. So I think I'll conclude my remarks and we can open it up after this. But I want to, the last section here is to think about, what would a form of writing responsive to experimental work look like? What would that be, right? If there were no obstacles, no financial constraints, if there were unlimited time, what form would that take? And I think we don't think through those kinds of questions enough. We think about the kind of limitations first, but I want to just create a space for thinking about the possibilities of what we would even want for that criticism. And again, I'm going to return to Mekas because he's visionary, I think, and take some cues from him. So let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so I'm not going to read the whole slide, but I'll give you a moment to just read some of it. And here I just want to draw your attention to the first sentence of the second paragraph. And he says, if the critic has any function at all, it is to look for something good and beautiful around him. So to seek out the good and beautiful, right? And that's like a particular expression of his values. And he mentions that in the video too. Not being interested, simply not interested in the works he didn't like, but wanting to celebrate. So to kind of amplifying work in a vein. Next slide, please. So in this one, he says, the trouble with our cinema is that we have film critics and film reviewers. We are taking our newspapers too seriously. It is a disaster. So to kind of deprofessionalize the practice of criticism in film writing, right? To make it less precious, to make it less serious, to open it up. And then the third and final slide here. I'll give you a moment to read this. There's so much in this one. I think this is a really beautiful entry. I like that he talks about rambling. Like, it's not tight writing at all. He is rambling, but it's poetic, right? And it leans into all these areas of things that interest him, leaves and filming and conversations with friends. And there's a humility to this piece and his attitude that I also admire, where he says, where is this one? In the second paragraph, right? He says, I don't know what any movie amounts to. I'm looking more for some light behind it, behind the images. I'm trying to see the man. And I like this also, that there's a kind of, especially with experimental work, that can be so challenging to write about, right? Just even in the very basic description of what it is you're seeing. If it's a hand-painted film, or it's processed chemically, or it has a structure that you have to describe formally or materially before you can even get a handle on what it is. To not know what any movie amounts to is that kind of fundamental humility before the object, that there's nothing to take for granted as you encounter it, but to search for something behind it, some kind of light. So I think maybe I'll end there, and we can open it up for discussion or questions. I'm very interested also in hearing about your experiences and challenges, or if you have any propositions regarding, a kind of responsive form, what your ideal would be, what could writing about experimental film look like. I would love to hear that too, because I'm still seeking. I can't see very well. I think I see a hand up there, but yeah.
Hola. Hi, good night.
Oh, okay, I'm gonna put on my...
Thank you for being here. No, in English is okay.
Okay.
I have this question. Kandinsky wrote in one of his little books that he thought that the most abstract form of expression was music. And then hearing to Mekas and relating a song to a film, do you think that in the search of the homeomeric, or in the search of the axiomatic truths that anyone is trying to say, you would say that the film critic today is also, it also has a lot of liberty and a lot of search to the abstraction? Like, if one form just takes parts from the other and it permeates a lot of stuff? Thank you.
Who was the the writer again?
Kandinsky.
Oh, Kandinsky. Okay, yeah. I mean, critics are writers, and writing is, an expressive form. So it's not. I don't necessarily see criticism as something that should be subordinate to the object that it's looking at, right? It's itself a way of engaging expressively, lyrically, poetically, politically with a set of ideas. It takes a different shape. It's more like ekphrasis, right? It's kind of in dialogue with, it can be in dialogue with another medium, another, and then we're in a kind of, we're talking in culture. That's what I like about criticism, is it exists in culture, but as an expressive form. And like, I can't see, to the like deeper truths. I mean, sure, I think that's, any writer, any serious writer is writing in a way to kind of investigate or find out for themselves what meaning that is. But the critic takes the path of finding that path through culture, as opposed to a novelist or, another form of writing. But I see that as like is truly, it is a meaningful and dignified, artistic practice in its own right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So when thinking about this idea of new formats, of alternative formats, I think we have been writing about cinema for a long time, and I was reading Raymond Velour the other day. These days I have been reading him, and I found out that he was fantasizing about things that we now have, but I think we're not really using them. Especially, well, in the 60s, I think he was thinking about the possibility of just stopping a movie, right? Mm-hmm. That was not possible back then. It is possible now, but we do not always do that when analyzing films, right? But the idea that caught my attention especially was that he was thinking about the possibility of creating an alternative montage that will reflect on the movie itself, maybe a different structure that will create a critical reflection of the movie. And I would say that is the video essay now. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But are we really using or even considering the video essay as part of film criticism? I think we're not, because it is mostly happening in YouTube, I'd say. So YouTube is not part of the academical work. So film criticism is still like bound to, of course, film journalism, and maybe academical journals as well. So what do you think about that? Because I think there are tools that could make. We could be making film criticism using the language of images. We're not doing it.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up video essay. I think that's a hugely important area. And there are journals devoted to like film essays, video essays. I'm thinking like Catherine Grant has been very active in this space, and I know Criterion produces video essays, and it's not a space that I'm in so much, but I really appreciate that thing. I mean, you could think like, Godard's Histoire du Cinéma is like video essay, right? It's like as practice, but it's criticism too. It's doing both of those things. It's so I'm excited by that, because it moves criticism back kind of into the space of practice. So I'm all for that, and I have no snobism against YouTube, I have no special like reverence for the academy. Like it has its own kind of like institutional function. to further people's careers, but I'm open to interesting, exciting ideas happening anywhere and being accessible, and that is truly, the great advantage of something like YouTube. For me, I've never been especially drawn to video essays myself and making them. My students make them a lot as assignments, but I like to think of programming actually as like a way of sort of doing criticism. It's just kind of, and it's without necessarily inserting my voice, but I might select a number of films that I think are, kind of on the same wavelength and stage a conversation that way, right? That's what I want to do. I do that in an academic essay too. I might talk about films in a sequence, but sometimes it's more fun to just put the films out and see how it responds, how it reverberates with an audience. So I like the way in which these kind of distinctions between programming, filmmaking, criticism maybe break down a bit. But yeah, I could say more about that too. But what's kind of amazing to me is this is something that the scholar Caitlin Benson-Allett writes about, that before the 80s, all the nearly 100 years of film writing, no one had a VCR. So yeah, so there's always mistakes. I guess that's why Jonas was talking about how he never made mistakes. He's really proud of that, because people made a lot of mistakes. They weren't reviewing films. They couldn't rewind or pause. So that's kind of an amazing fact of like how we encounter these objects and what kind of tools are available. And yeah, Ballure fantasized about something that became a kind of banal reality that doesn't get really used. I have to really like force my students to rewatch scenes, and they're not interested in like pausing to look at a frame. That's a kind of attention that needs to be trained. But thank you. Other questions or comments? Anybody? Was that a hand? No. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, well, I think this question comes from the same space that the one I did before. One thing that is pretty noticeable is that when you look at the canon of film criticism, you will see filmmakers there, like, I don't know, Godard, Truffaut, Pasolini, and the likes, Eisenstein.
Absolutely.
And it seems, I might be wrong, but I think that's not happening anymore. There are filmmakers and there are film critics. So there's like a breach in there. And that's something that I find very interesting. What do you think caused that breach? And do you think we can somehow go back to, or like maybe close that breach a little bit?
Yeah, that's something I've thought about a lot, this kind of, what happened to the filmmaker, writer. I'm thinking of like these manifestos by like Brakhage or Deren, or, often in the pages of film culture. And where has that writing gone? I don't have a ready answer for that. I'd have to think about it a bit more, but my sense is it has to do with like, the kind of institutional conditions for showing work. So I feel like a lot of writing energy for filmmakers goes into like grant writing and program notes and those kinds of spaces, right? Those are the given things. It's maybe less intuitive to think about writing beyond just like the artist statement, right? The artist statement is so pervasive, but I don't know very much that happens beyond that space. one of the slides I wanted to show was a project I was involved in very recently, but it's so recent that it's not yet available online, that I was invited by these artists, Danny Restack and Sheila Restack, and another curator artist, Mason Lieber-Yap. And they just invited me, instead of writing like a critical response, just to enter into like a blank Google Doc with them and to just start writing, talking, and sharing things, and in response to a set of works that they've been exhibiting that's on, I think currently up in Nuremberg. And that was really exciting. That was fun. And I was like, I don't know who I am is participating in this, who's asking the questions, who's answering, like that wasn't at all clear. But I thought it was a really generative and exciting experience. And it was kind of like being folded into their practice, if you're familiar with Danny and Sheila's work. But, like and I would hold my position, like this is me being an admirer and a viewer of your work over many years, and also living my own life and experiencing things, in a particular way. So, I just lost my train of thought, but that was, I think there's room for that too. And I was glad to see Danny and Sheila writing as well, to be excited to explore that space. Yeah, Casper.
I just want to add on the idea of essay, and also on maybe a form that goes a bit beyond that and let writers stay in a way at the same time inside cinema and outside cinema, which is the now so much emerging and popular becoming desktop essay. Mm-hmm. So if I would think of what mostly it's Kevin Lee and Chloé Labarthe-Meunier, plus hundreds of others that so far haven't surfaced to this, maybe to this level that they are so prominent with this form. But what I find so fascinating in this, and also in the idea of exactly these transgressing these boundaries, what you also talked about, I find it highly interesting that you were saying programming is a form of criticism. And I guess for a critic or for a writer to make that huge step to make a film is somewhat tricky. Mm-hmm. And nowadays we have so much of forms that sit right in between. I think the desktop mm-hmm. essay is a perfect reflection of that, because it is basically not more than documenting what you have on your desktop and comparing different documents and maybe comment on it.
Yeah.
And I think between those two, it was so interesting that now then comes something similar that you right now describe like almost as an online jamming, so that these two suddenly, even in that, with that form entering into kind of an epistolary mode and going back and forth and doing remotely mm-hmm. a joint project. So I think these are forms that really only with kind of an easiness of shared online culture come into play, and maybe do something in that direction, what you also so much after in terms of hybrid forms or new styles of criticism / filmmaking.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's exciting too, and I have a hard time imagining, and maybe this is not fair to people, but like a very, somebody who's very sedimented in their practice as a sculptor or a painter, maybe they just want to keep painting and that's fine, and keep sculpting. What I like about experimental film, again, and this is why I keep signaling this moment of the 50s and 60s, is this kind of like embrace of things. It's like constantly, trying to disrupt those boundaries. I feel like one thing that Mekas is writing about a lot, or is well known for writing about, is the way in which Flaming Creatures was censored. He was very much up in arms around the censorship of a number of films that he championed. And I think that was really generative for him, that to encounter restriction was a way of generating new ideas and to move, I think that you can see that in other areas of his practice. So if there's a form to inherit that transgressive, energy, I'm going to locate it in the best of what we call experimental film or avant-garde cinema, as opposed to, I just don't necessarily see it in other spaces of art making. I could be wrong, but I think there's a, to follow the lead of someone like Mekas is to be willing to experiment and to move into those spaces, and certainly augmented by the kind of forms of like remote intimacy that online, like digital technologies afford us. Thanks, Casper. Anyone else?
Hi, I wanted to ask you what do you think about, there was this remark of Pierre Sitney where he said something like, there are no writers now, only curators. And I feel that all the canonical films of the American avant-garde are remembered now because of people like Pierre Sitney and Jonas Mekas. So now we have like, I don't know, this festival in the San Francisco Cinematheque, and there's like 50 films every year, and nobody writes about these films, nobody remembers these films the next year. So I don't know, I think it's very sad, and because everyone wants to be, I mean, it's part of like an economical reality, as you said, because as a curator, you get paid, and not as a writer. So I was just wondering, what do you think we can do about this, or what's your position in this whole thing?
I have so much fondness for P. Adam Sitney, because he was my professor, so I feel like very protective of him in a way. But he loves, with good reason, right? His writing is so influential, and so set up a kind of taxonomy and a set of categories that we kind of still accept as a canon of at least American or North American avant-garde cinema. But like prone to bombast sometimes, and I think there are no writers, there are only curators. I don't know that remark, but that definitely sounds like him. It's a funny thing. I'm going to just say something that seems like against the premise of this workshop or whatever this is like, I don't want to even be precious about writing. I think viewing something and then talking about it afterward has immense value. And like, do things need to be permanent to be of value in culture? I don't really think so. I think ephemerality is also a tradition, well worn by experimental film. And I can see the point that films that are made now, right, they're kind of run through like a kind of hamster wheel of the festival circuit where, the films will kind of get exhibited, a handful of times in a year and then will just disappear. I don't know that that's the fault of the writer or even the curator. And I think we as people that participate in that and want to participate and want to celebrate it, we do what we can, And I think there are going to be, I'm on the board of the Flaherty Film Seminar, and a lot of what is magical about the Flaherty, and I know some of you maybe have attended it, is just the long conversations that happen. And I don't even mean in the kind of official discussion space after the films. I just mean, at meals or on walks. And it's just, what matters, I think, is creating the spaces to really take in the work and to have the attention and maybe see what comes out of that. Maybe that's a bit naive of me, but there's a lot of writing actually out there. And most of it isn't very good, and most of the films are not very good either. So, but that's for us to make sense of. I don't know if that satisfied your question, but that's sort of where I stand. Is there anyone else? I thought I saw a hand sort of down here. Yeah.
Yeah. Good evening, Professor. I would just, I would like to start by saying that I really appreciate the fact that you opened up a space for going beyond criticism and starting opening a space for creation. Like you said, what would we do? Forgive me. What would happen if we realized that we have everything we need? I mean, what if we just did criticism as just a way of finding, in the words of Mekas, finding beauty, right? So I think, that was very important, because I feel like you're in a way doing the work he did with his criticism, providing this space of the proposal you made, I think, was of imagining just what we would do, and like what would a job as a critic would be. I mean, probably what if we focus on the observer role as also the eye of the, not as like Mecca said, like not finding mistakes, but rather just being present with it, finding what makes it beautiful, and just like an artist does, right? So thank you for you shifting the energy just towards a reflexive state, as a generative, like I'm just rambling, or what was
That's okay.
but thank you.
Yeah, just to underscore that, I think, and also partially to respond to the last question too, that, if you think of being a critic or writing about film, not as a job, but as a practice, maybe that's a way of shifting your relationship to the field, right? So, Sitney's formulation of being a critic is kind of assuming an authority or having some kind of responsibility of the work, then maybe we might kind of shift that to like a lower C critic and just say, I'm doing my practice, I'm responding to work, I'm selecting things that strike me. I may not understand that. I may approach that with the humility that Mekas did, right? I don't quite know what any film amounts to. Then I think that opens up a space for inserting oneself into a very complex dynamic of filmmaking, exhibition, right? With all the shortcomings and like institutional economic realities that brings with it. I still think, and this is where I'm like quite an optimist, and I still like really believe in cinema. So I think that's the kind of the guiding space for me too. But to not, I don't assume responsibility for other people's practice. I just want to talk about it.
Okay, I'm going to ask it in Spanish. It's okay?
Oh yeah.
pues me gustaría familiarizarme un poco más con la forma en que tú escribes sobre la crítica. Entonces, no sé, ahorita se me ocurrió si nos pudieras contar un poco sobre una película o algún trabajo audiovisual justo que te levante todo este ánimo del que estamos hablando, que te provoca escribir, que pudieras decirnos un poco, pues tú cómo ves, puedes decir igual el título de la película, algo, y decirnos como algunos puntos que tú ves muy importantes de hablar de esa película. Todo esto para familiarizarme un poco más con tu forma de percibir pues el cine o todo esto.
Sure. So a question of particular example of a film that I've written about or that is exciting that opens these questions. I mean, I was reflecting on there's from last year the film What Do We See When We Look at the Sky, and I was asked to write a 200-word end of year capsule review for it, and it was like the hardest thing I've done in a really long time, because then I realized in trying to fit this film into 200 words how expansive the film was, and that was. And I was trying, and I was thinking, I don't know if you've seen the film, but the film involves like this bar that is set up on a bridge. So it's like this large structure, and like people hang on the bar, and if they can hang on it for like a full minute, then they get like some money. But otherwise, they give the money to the person standing there. And I was excited by the bar being a kind of frame and a lens to see through the world. And I was trying to write about this, and it was extremely difficult to fit into that space. And I was frustrated, but it was also generative, because it was a good reminder that, oh yeah, sometimes like what I'm tasked to do, the assignment I'm given, the film is just gonna like refuse that. It's gonna make that hard for me. And it was like the film was alive, and I had to, it's like, putting a cat into like a carrier. It's just like wouldn't fit. I didn't want to do it. And it was very challenging for me. So that was kind of exciting. I needed a lot of help from my editor with that. It's not my best writing, but I just like that challenge. And I mentioned at the outset, I'm working on this book series with Erica Balsam, who's one of my favorite writers. So we're co-editing this series. It's called Cutaways. And the idea is it's like little books on single motifs or themes or formal devices. And the idea is, here's about 25,000 words you, the writer, can have. You can play with this space and pick, just some angle, some device to talk about film, any number of film, any range or period or context, and make it distinctive. Make it a book that no one else could write, except that it's very much about it's like a prompt for the writer to experiment with the form. So I'm very excited about that, because it's been really fun to be the editor for that and to work with writers and to just be entering that thought process that is so distinctive for each person. And even the topics people come up with are so distinctive to their voices. So I'm really grateful we were able to get that approved at a press, and so that's entering into production right now. So I'm hopeful for those spaces. And the feedback Erica and I have been getting for this series is that a lot of people want to write for it, and a lot of academics who are just like so tired of being straitjacketed by the conventions of academic writing are very excited about it, because it was very liberating for them too. So, but for us, it's meant to be a kind of meeting place for critics, scholars, filmmakers, programmers, people who have this investment. Filmmakers, of course, let's bring back filmmaker writers to just play with this space, play with it, muck around in this space. So hope that answers your question.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. I'm really happy that we're having this chat with you. I just wanted to, instead of a question, it was I wanted to point out the fact that being a Latin American filmmaker, like experimental filmmaker, it's very easy to see that this practice of writing, and it's almost non-existent. Like there's I mean, there's a lot of situations about that. First of all, you get someone writing about your movie if it makes it to a festival, like an international festival or something. So we don't have our own writers, and the ones outside, they don't pay attention because they are very busy looking at their situation, right? So we're kind of a black hole or something like that. And that's pretty sad because, I mean, if we usually have some problems with filmmaking, like the differences between budgets, and also we always have to fit some standards with the rest of the filmmakers. And on top of that, we're really not used to that. I mean, the first time I got a review is because one of my shortcuts made it to short films. I mean, made it to a festival for the first time in the States, and I was like, a review? What the hell is that? You know, it was kind of exciting, but I didn't. I mean, I just realized that we don't really have. Probably young students here in Mexico are kind of excited about this situation because of the internet, and the reviews are like on the web, and they are faster and stuff like that. But yeah, maybe if you're aware of this outsider situation here in Latin America in general, from Mexico to Argentina.
Yeah, I don't know. Thank you for that question. I don't know the situation. I do know, you know, even in the North American context, there's just this feeling like, oh, there just isn't anyone writing, even in the spaces where people are sometimes writing. So, I mean, I would hope to like flip that and just say, let's turn that into the position of possibility, because, you know, I mean, I'm thinking of like, there are certain spaces where, you know, they're like like incubators. I think Rotterdam has a program like that, and like there's one at Cannes, and you know, of course these are like major international film festivals. But with that comes, you know, that's like a double-edged sword too, right? That comes with a kind of these presumptions of professionalization and, you know, again, like a certain like conservatism within the form itself. But you know, if there is like student energy, if there's energy at all, that we have platforms, and there is maybe opportunity to write about that, right? That could be self-organized in a DIY kind of way. I mean, I think a lot of journals just start out because a lot of young people want to write, you know, are excited about movies and want to write about them. So even if a journal only lasts like 1 or 2 issues, as is sometimes the case, often the case, you know, that's something too. I mean, it's like too massive to get into the like, you know, like the funding, state funding, austerity kind of conversation right now, just about funding for the arts in general and for these auxiliary practices. But one nice thing about writing is that it's not very expensive to do. So, you know, if you feel compelled as like a filmmaker to write about your work or someone else's work, that's, you know, I would encourage that, and hopefully that would nourish and nurture a local community, right? And then hopefully then maybe that would get picked up somewhere else, but maybe not, but that could be exciting. So yeah, I hope that could feel possible, you know. Yes, up in the top. And then I think this will be our last question, and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, this is just a quick comment, but the last exchange made me think also about that, like the question isn't just whether there are writers, but also whether there's a readership. And when you opened your lecture, you were talking about kind of the niche readership around journals, right? And I think that's maybe what more than anything is lacking or what we mean when we say that there aren't writers, is more that maybe people are writing, but when things are online or really diffused, that there isn't necessarily like a central readership.
Sure.
And I guess that was more of a comment that just came to mind, but I wonder if you think that that's also the case, or if there are circles where you think that there is more of an active readership, or
Yeah, I mean, this is where I turn back to Mekas, right? That he was just thinking about expanding the readership or addressing audiences other than the immediate. I mean, he's like kind of dialectical in this way too. You know, he made Walden as like a film for a few people and some friends, and his ambitions were not, you know, to reach, you know, like every multiplex in the country, yeah, I think you know, I think with experimental film, especially if you're in this world, you're used to kind of small audiences and a small community. And maybe the emphasis should just be on the community at first, and like, again, what serves that community before like trying to seek out something broader than that, right? But I do think like writing, you know, and not just criticism, but, you know, things like program notes or Danny and Sheila's like little experiment. Those are just kind of pieces that, you know, help shape and flesh out a community. So I think it all fits in the same bucket, and whether or not people read it isn't maybe not a less important question. Also, I'm coming from academia where like people don't read anything. So like when I've published in like something like Reverse Shot and it's like about experimental film, I know there's a much bigger readership than like any academic article I've produced. So actually there's potential for quite an audience when you look at it from that perspective. But I think we should wrap up. I think I'm getting the cutoff signal. So thank you all for your attention. Thanks for coming tonight. Thanks.